The night Nora Vance came pounding on my door, I had a cold supper going hard on the plate, sawdust still in the creases of my hands, and no idea that by sunrise my name would be tied to hers on a county form. It was past 11. The first real freeze of the year was coming down out of the hills, and you could feel it in the dark, that dry, mean cold that settles on an orchard and goes looking for anything green and soft to ruin. I'd spent the evening in the cider barn patching a cracked feed line on the press, and I'd just sat down to eat when the knocking started. Not a knock, really. Pounding. The kind of sound that doesn't ask if you're home, it tells you to hurry. I set my fork down. Nobody drives out to my place that late unless something has gone wrong. Out here, a midnight visitor means a tree's down across the road, or somebody's truck went off the shoulder by the creek, or there's been a death. My wife used to say a knock after dark was always trouble wearing a coat. Marie's been gone 3 years now, but I still heard her voice say it as I crossed the kitchen. I opened the door, and there was Nora. For a second, I didn't place her. She had her hood up against the cold, her face white and her lips nearly the same color, and both hands wrapped around a flat tin box like it was the only thing holding her on her feet. She was Frank Vance's girl from the orchard that bordered mine on the south side. I'd known her since she was small enough to ride the bin trailer at harvest, but I hadn't known her well in years. She'd gone off to the city for nursing school, came back here and there, then came back for good, when Frank got sick. Frank I'd known my whole life. Now Frank was 3 weeks in the ground, and his daughter was standing on my porch, shaking hard enough to rattle the tin in her hands. "Wade," she said. My name came out cracked. I looked past her into the yard. "You walk here?" She nodded. "From the gate. Dale took my keys." That woke me up faster than coffee. "Come inside." She stepped over the threshold, and I shut the door against the cold. She stood in the middle of my front room, dripping nothing. It wasn't raining, the cold was the dry kind, but trembling all the same, the way a person does when the shaking isn't about temperature. I pulled a quilt off the back of the couch, Marie's quilt, the one with the faded apple blossom squares, and put it around her shoulders before I'd thought about it. She gripped it without looking at it. "What happened?" She didn't sit. She just stood there holding that tin box, and I noticed her thumb kept moving over the lid, back and forth, the way you'd rub a worry stone. "It's the will," she said. "Sit down first." "I can't." "Nora." That seemed to reach her. She blinked, looked around like she'd forgotten where she was, then went to the kitchen table and sat. I put the kettle on, mostly to give my hands a job. She set the tin down and opened it. Inside were papers, folded, soft at the creases from being handled too many times, and laid across the top of them, a small bone-handled knife. A grafting knife. I knew it on sight. Frank carried that knife for 40 years. I'd watched him use it to splice a scion onto rootstock 100 times. That little curved blade slicing clean, his thumb guiding it like he was born holding it. Seeing it in her hands did something to my chest I wasn't ready for. She spread the papers out. Legal pages, signatures, a stamp from the county clerk. I don't read that kind of thing well. I know harvest tallies, fuel receipts, the slow arithmetic of a bad season. Lawyer language always seemed written to make plain people feel like fools. "My father put a condition in it," she said. "I didn't know. Nobody told me until this afternoon." "What kind of condition?" She kept her eyes down. "If I'm not married by the deadline, I don't get control of the orchard. Dale becomes co-trustee. He gets the deciding vote on the land." I went still. The kettle started to tick on the burner. "Married," I said. Not a question, just the word, set down between us to look at. "I know how it sounds." Her face was caught between angry and ashamed, and she couldn't decide which way to fall. Dad thought he was protecting me. I think he wrote it when he was scared near the end, when the morphine had him saying things I didn't recognize. He always thought I'd run if it got hard. He thought if there was somebody steady beside me, Dale couldn't bully me off the land. She gave a short breath that wanted to be a laugh and wasn't. The attorney says it's airtight. I turned the burner off. The kettle hadn't quite screamed yet. When's the deadline? Friday. It was Monday night. I poured hot water into 2 mugs we didn't need. And Dale? Drove in this morning. She wrapped both hands around her mug. Leased SUV. New boots that have never touched mud. Talking about Dad's orchard like the trees were already firewood. He's got a company coming Thursday. Hartwell Properties. They build lakeside cabins, resort rentals. He says the land's worth 4 times more cleared than it ever was in apples. She looked up at me. He wants to bulldoze it, Wade. All of it. Dad's whole life. That settled into me like a cold stone. I've met men like Dale. They stand at the edge of a 40-year orchard and they don't see trees, they see lots. They look at a cider barn and see scrap lumber and a slab they can pour over. They always say the same things. Be smart. Take the money. Move on. Like the land is just dirt and not the years a man burned into it, root by root. She slid one of the papers toward me. He left a note, not in the will, but folded with it. He wrote your name. I didn't touch it. He wrote that if anything happened, you were the one neighbor who'd understand, that you'd know what the place was worth that wasn't money. Her voice thinned to almost nothing. I didn't know who else to come to. What are you asking me, Nora? She made herself look at me then. Her eyes were red-rimmed, but she held my stare like it cost her something to do it. I'm asking you to marry me. The kitchen got so quiet I could hear the refrigerator hum and the cold ticking against the window pane. I leaned back in my chair. Nora, I know. I don't think you do. I do, she said fast. I know it's crazy. I know it's unfair to drag you into my mess, but there's no one else. Dale's already telling the workers I'm a city girl who'll quit by Christmas. The pickers don't know whose word counts anymore. The lawyer keeps saying the deadline like I can fix it by panicking harder. You're the only person my father trusted enough to write down. I rubbed both hands down my face. I was tired in the bone way, the way 3 years of running a place alone makes you. Too tired for something this size. Too tired for a woman at my table asking me to put my name beside hers on a license like we were co-signing for a tractor. Are you trying to use me? I asked. Her mouth opened, then closed. For the first time since she'd come in, she went completely still. Yes, she said quiet, but not the way you mean. I'm asking for help, and I won't insult you by pretending it's anything prettier than that. That honest answer hit me harder than any polished one would have. I looked around my kitchen. Same yellow walls Marie painted the spring before she got sick. Same table where my father used to spread the bills and tell my mother they weren't as bad as they were. I knew what it was to be handed land before you felt old enough to carry it. I knew what it was to have a whole county standing back, waiting to watch you fail. I don't want to lose my father's orchard, Nora said. Her thumb found the bone handle of that grafting knife and held it. I believe you. And I did. I could hear it under everything else. But I shook my head. Marriage means something, Nora. I know. No, I mean it means something. It's not a box you check and forget. I know, she said again, smaller this time. But losing the place means something too. That was the whole trouble. She was right. I stood and went to the back door. Through the glass there was nothing but black, and my own kitchen reflected back faint over the dark. Somewhere out past the porch light, my rows ran down to the fence line, and past that fence ran Frank's. That property line had been there longer than either of us. Frank kept good trees. Late on his payments sometimes, same as everybody in a dry year, but he kept the place honest, and he kept grafting those old heritage apples nobody else bothered with, the ones that don't ship well and taste like something you can't buy. If Dale sold it, that fence line would turn into survey stakes and a backhoe. I turned around. If I say yes, there's one rule. She sat up. No lies between us. I said it plain. Not in this house, not at this table. To the town, to your uncle, to whoever, we do what we have to do. But between you and me, we stay clean. You don't pretend this is love, and I don't pretend I'm rescuing anybody. We both know exactly what it is." She nodded, slow. "And if it gets ugly, you don't keep things from me." "I won't," she said. I looked at her a long second. The white face, the tin box, the way she was trying so hard not to look as scared as she was. Then I looked at Marie's quilt around her shoulders and felt something twist that I pushed back down. "All right," I said. "We'll drive to the courthouse in the morning." Her face changed, but it wasn't relief exactly. It was more like the weight shifted and almost took her under in its new shape. "Thank you," she whispered. I just nodded, because I didn't trust my voice. We drove into town the next morning in my old truck with the heater roaring and neither of us saying much. Nora wore a gray dress under her work coat, like she'd tried to make the day look normal, and only half managed it. I had on my cleanest shirt, which still had a thin line of cider stain near the cuff that no wash had ever taken out. She held that tin box in her lap the whole way, both hands flat on the lid. At the courthouse, the clerk looked from her to me and back, polite about it, but plainly doing the arithmetic in her head. We signed where she pointed. A justice of the peace with a head cold read the words off a laminated card. Nora's hand was cold as a creek stone when I took it. Mine was rough, and I felt it. There were no flowers, no family, no music. Just the buzz of a bad light overhead and two people promising something neither of them had planned to promise that week. When it was done, Nora looked at the certificate like it might catch fire. "Now," I said, "we keep your father's orchard standing." She nodded, but her eyes were on me, not the paper. And that was the first moment I understood this was not going to stay as simple as I'd told myself it would. She moved into my house that afternoon with 2 duffel bags, a box of papers she didn't trust Dale to leave alone, and that tin with the grafting knife. I gave her the back bedroom at the end of the hall. It had a window that looked out over the south rows and a dresser that stuck if you yanked the top drawer too hard. She stood in the doorway with her bag still in her hands like she was waiting for me to say something that would make any of it ordinary. I didn't have anything ordinary. "Bathroom's across the hall," I said. "The water runs cold a minute before it warms up. You learn to wait it out." "Thank you. You don't have to thank me every time I point at a piece of furniture." That almost got a smile out of her. Almost. The first days, we moved around each other like two people sharing a fence with a Greenbroke horse on the other side of it. We drank our coffee at the same table, and neither of us knew where to put our eyes. She kept asking if she could use things, the kettle, the good knife, the truck, and I kept telling her she lived here now, and then feeling odd every time I said it. At night, she went down the hall and shut her door soft. I lay awake in mine longer than usual, listening to the house make its small old sounds, the pipes ticking, the wind working at the eaves. Once I heard her come out, stop in the kitchen a while, then go back. I didn't ask. In the morning, the last jar of Frank's cider was sitting on the windowsill over the sink, where it caught the early light gold and brown. She'd put it there. She didn't say anything about it, and neither did I, but it stayed there after that. And some mornings I'd catch her looking at it while the coffee dripped. On the second evening, she walked the south end of my place by herself while I closed up the barn, and when she came back, her face had a question on it she wasn't sure she was allowed to ask. "There's a whole block down by your creek that's just stumps," she said. "Pulled trees. Must be 20 rows. Why'd you take them out and never replant?" I wiped my hands on a rag longer than the job needed. "Marie planted that block the first spring we were married. Galus mostly. She wanted a block that was hers, that I hadn't decided for her. I hung the rag on its nail. When she got sick, I let it go. Fire blight came through the year she passed, and I didn't have it in me to fight it. By the time I looked up, the whole block was dead wood. I pulled the trees so I wouldn't have to look at them dying, and then I never could make myself put anything back in that ground. Nora didn't say she was sorry, which I was grateful for. People say they're sorry, and then they want you to make them feel better about having said it. That's a lot of good ground sitting empty, she said instead. It is. She looked at me a second. My father had a way of saying that empty ground is just ground that's waiting on somebody to make up their mind. Then she went on inside and left me standing there in the dark, looking down at 20 rows of stumps I'd been calling grief for 3 years, when maybe all that time they'd only been waiting. I didn't sleep much that night either, but it wasn't the same kind of not sleeping. By Wednesday, the whole valley knew. That's how a small place works. You can buy a box of pruning shears at 8 in the morning, and by noon somebody's mother knows the brand. At the co-op, Diane behind the counter looked at the band on Nora's finger, then at me, and didn't say anything rude. She just raised one eyebrow up near her hairline. "Well," she said, "that was quick." Nora went red to the ears. I set a sack of dormant oil and 2 rolls of grafting tape on the counter. "Need a case of paraffin too if you've got it in back." Diane looked at me like that wasn't the answer she'd been fishing for, but she rang it up. "Congratulations, I suppose." "Thank you," Nora said, barely. Out in the lot, while I loaded the truck, Nora stood by the door with her arms crossed tight. "Everybody thinks I'm a joke." "No," I said. "Everybody's curious. Different thing." "Feels the same." "It isn't." She looked across the lot at 2 men by a flatbed who'd quit talking the second we walked out. "Do you regret it yet?" I dropped the last sack in the bed. "It's been a day and a half." That's not an answer. "No," I said. "I don't regret it." She nodded, but I could see she wasn't all the way convinced. Dale came to the Vance orchard the next morning. I saw the SUV before I saw him, parked crooked across 2 spots near the cider barn like the painted lines were beneath him. He stood by the loading dock in a dark wool coat with his clean boots, talking to 2 of the pickers, Earl and a younger man named Diego, talking with his hands like he already owned their attention. Nora stiffened beside me. "Keep walking," I said. "Slow, like there's nowhere you'd rather be." She did, but I saw her grip tighten on the clipboard she carried. Dale turned when we came up. He had the kind of smile a man wears when he wants everybody to know he isn't worried. "Well," he said, "if it isn't the happy couple." Nora lifted her chin. "What do you need, Dale?" "This is still my brother's property, which makes it my responsibility last I checked." He looked me up and down and laughed once, soft. "You married a man with a mortgaged orchard and a dead wife's quilt on the spare bed, and now you figure you can run a cider operation? Honey, you couldn't run a checkbook in this family." Earl looked down at his boots. Diego studied the dock. That bothered me more than anything Dale said, because those were good men, and they were standing there, waiting to see whose word was going to carry weight, hers or his. Nora opened her mouth and nothing came. Dale stepped in closer, gentle as a snake. "You're making this harder than it has to be. Take the money. Go be a nurse somewhere that doesn't smell like rotten windfalls. Let the grown-ups handle the dirt." I felt myself move half a step before I'd decided to. Nora felt it. So did Dale. He turned that smile on me. "And you. Smooth play, Kerrigan. Marry the girl, plant your flag on Vance land, and suddenly you've doubled your acres without buying a thing. Frank's barely cold." My hands curled once, then I made them open. I learned a long time ago that temper doesn't mend a fence, pay a note, or win a thing in front of men who are watching to see who breaks. "I'm standing next to my wife," I said. "That's the whole play." Nora glanced at me when I said it. Wife. The word landed heavier in that loading dock than it had under the courthouse lights. Dale rolled his eyes and turned to the workers. "Nobody makes any big decisions till this estate's settled. Not her, not him. We clear?" Nora found her voice. "That's not your call." "Isn't it?" "No," she said, a little shaky. "It isn't." Dale looked amused, but I caught Earl, the old foreman, glance at her sideways, not convinced, but listening. That was something. After Dale's SUV pulled out, Nora walked into the cider barn and put both hands flat on the cold steel of the press like she needed it to hold her up. "You answered him," I said. "Barely. Barely counts. First time out." She let out a breath. "You could have shut him down. You wanted to. I saw it." "I could have. So why didn't you?" "Because then they'd all learn to look at me," I said. "And I'm not going to be here forever. They need to learn to look at you." She didn't like that answer at first. I watched it move across her face, but she didn't argue. That afternoon, I sat her down with the orchard's books in the little office off the barn, the one Frank ran on a kerosene smell and pure stubbornness. She chewed the end of a pencil while I walked her through it. Which packing house gave Frank an extra 2 weeks when cash ran thin? Which supplier smiled at you while he added a fee on the back of the invoice? This one, I tapped a paper. You call them before the due date. Don't wait for them to call you. It makes you look like you're driving. I'm not driving. I don't know the first thing about half of this. Looking like you do is most of the job, until one day you actually are. She wrote that down. "What?" I said. "What?" "I didn't mean for you to literally write it down." "I'm not wasting good advice." She didn't look up, but the corner of her mouth moved, and for the first time all week the air between us went a little loose. The real test came 2 days later, out in the East Block where Frank had his young grafts. A whole row of 2-year trees needed their stakes reset and their leaders tied off before the freeze got serious. And a section of deer fence had sagged where a buck had gone through it. Earl was already out there with the tools when we walked up. Nora told him she wanted the fence brace replaced, not patched. Earl looked straight past her to me. "You want that done today?" he asked me. I didn't answer. I crouched down and started scraping mud off my boot heel with a twig like it was the most important work in the county. Earl waited. Nora looked at me, and I watched the panic flash up behind her eyes. I kept scraping that boot. Finally, she cleared her throat. "Earl, replace the brace today. If we just patch it, the next hard wind puts a buck right back in this row, and we lose the grafts my father spent 2 years making. Do it right the first time." Earl shifted his weight. "Brace'll cost more than a patch." "I know what it costs," she said. "Do it right." There was a long second where nobody moved. Then Earl nodded, slow. "Yes, ma'am." Nora's face went bright red, but she held it together until he'd walked off toward the truck. Then she rounded on me. "You could have helped." "I did." "You scraped your boot." "Exactly." She stared at me, mad for about 3 seconds, and then the corner of her mouth went again. "That was awful." "Yep. I hated every second." "Yep." But he listened. He did. That evening she cooked without asking me where anything was. Eggs and fried potatoes and the heel of a loaf. Nothing you'd write home about. But she set a plate down in front of me like she'd done it 1,000 times. "You didn't eat lunch," she said. "Was busy." "You always say that." Usually true. She sat across from me with her sleeves shoved up and a smudge of dirt on her jaw she'd missed. She looked tired in a different way than she had that first night. Less lost. More worn down from actually fighting something, which is a better kind of tired. After supper, I found her at the kitchen table with the orchard bills sorted into neat little stacks, each one flagged with a torn piece of paper. Pay now. Call first. Ask Wade. That last stack made me shake my head. "You don't have to ask me everything." "I know," she said, not looking up. "But I don't know yet what I don't know." I leaned on the counter. "That's fair." She glanced down the hall toward the bedrooms. "This is strange, isn't it?" "What part?" She gave me a look. "All of it," I said. "Yeah. I keep thinking I'll wake up back at Dad's and he'll be in the barn, and Dale won't exist, and I won't have a husband 2 doors down. Technically, you have a husband 2 doors down who's trying to sleep. Big difference. That got a real smile out of her, the first one all the way up to her eyes. I looked away first and went and rinsed my plate because something had shifted in my chest and I wasn't ready to give it a name. We still had separate rooms. We still had the rule. On paper, the marriage had a deadline and a purpose. But by the end of that week, she knew I took my coffee black and burned, and I knew she tapped her pencil twice against the table before she made a call she was scared of. That didn't feel like paperwork. It felt like the start of something I hadn't planned on at all. Dale waited the better part of a week before his next move, which told me he'd been thinking, and that worried me more than him shouting would have. I was up a ladder in the late block, knocking the last of the keeper apples loose into a picking bag, when Nora came across the orchard fast, her phone in one hand and her hat in the other. She didn't slow down at the headland. "He's here," she said. "At the orchard. Dale, with 2 men I don't know. Earl called me. He says they're walking the back blocks toward the old grafts." I came down the ladder. "Buyers. That's what that is." Her face was tight, and underneath it I saw the same fear from the night she came to my door. Not as wild now, but still there. I pulled the truck keys out of my coat. "Let's go." She was in the cab before I was. The whole way over she stared through the windshield, breathing careful, like she was rationing it. When we pulled into the Vance yard, Dale was out by the east block with 2 men in clean quilted jackets. One of them had on a pair of loafers, town loafers, in an orchard soft from the night's frost melt. That was the first thing I clocked. Loafers in the mud. Dale turned and his smile came up when he saw us. "Nora, good. Saves me a phone call." She got out and shut the door harder than she meant to. "What are you doing?" "Showing some interested parties the property." "It's not for sale." One of the men shifted, uncomfortable. The other looked at Dale like he wanted him to handle whatever this was. Dale strolled toward us. "Easy. It will be. Soon as the estate stops indulging this little courthouse stunt." He gestured back at the rows, at the men, at the whole world. "Gentlemen, you're looking at 30 acres of mature orchard, county water rights, a creek frontage that, cleared, runs right down toward the lake road." "This orchard is not for sale," Nora said again. Dale laughed like she'd told a joke at the dinner table. "You hear that? Married 5 minutes and she thinks she's an owner." "I am the owner," Nora said. Her voice shook, but it kept going. "And you don't get to walk strangers through my father's trees without asking me." Dale's smile thinned. "Your confidence is fake. Your marriage is fake. And the day Kerrigan there gets tired of playing house, you'll be standing in this exact spot, alone, with a stack of bills you can't read, and a crew that won't take your word for the time of day." The words landed where he aimed them. I watched her take the hit, her shoulders drop a half-inch. I wanted to step in front of her and tell Dale precisely what I thought of a man in town loafers lecturing about land he hadn't touched in 20 years, but she got her chin up before I could open my mouth. "Then I guess you'd better get them off my property," she said, "before you waste any more of their afternoon." The yard went quiet. One of the buyers cleared his throat. "Dale, maybe we ought to—" Dale shot him a look, then turned back to Nora. "You'll regret this." "Maybe," she said, "but I'll regret selling it more." That was the first time I saw old Earl crack a smile at her, just at the corner of his mouth, before he wiped it away. Dale left angry, the SUV spitting gravel by the cattle guard. The 2 buyers followed him out, slower, a good deal less sure of things than they'd come in. Nora stood there until both sets of taillights were gone down the lake road. Then she turned and walked straight into the cider barn. I found her in the back by the apple bins with one hand pressed flat to the cold wall. "I thought I was going to be sick," she said. "You weren't. That's your comfort?" "It's the truth." She laughed, weak, and put both hands over her face. "He's right about some of it. I can't read those books. Not really. Not the way Dad could. He's wrong about most of it. I don't know how to run all this, Wade." You don't know how to run all of it today, I said. She lowered her hands and looked at me. That's a different sentence. Tomorrow you learn another piece, then another. That's how everybody who ever did this learned it, your father included. You make it sound simple. It isn't simple, it's just possible. Those aren't the same thing. She looked at me a long moment, and something in her face went soft. Not relief exactly, more like she'd been waiting a long while for somebody to tell her she didn't have to turn into Frank overnight to be worth the land. That night, she stayed up late at my table with a stack of pruning estimates. I came in from walking the late block and found a plate covered in foil sitting warm on the back of the stove. You cooked, I said. Barely. Don't get sentimental about it. I lifted the foil. Pork chops and beans. Too late. She rolled her eyes, but I caught the smile she tried to hide behind her coffee. Things changed after that. Not loud. She stopped asking me before every call. She started phoning the packing house herself. She booked a delivery date that didn't work, caught the mistake, and fixed it herself before she ever told me it had happened. She got a sunburn across her nose from a clear, cold afternoon up a ladder. She tore the sleeve of her coat on a wire and kept working with the stuffing leaking out of it. One morning, Earl walked up and asked her a question before he asked me. Just a simple thing about which block to spray first, and she answered it level. But in the truck after she whispered, "Did you hear that?" I heard. He asked me. He did. She looked out the window at the rows going by, trying not to make too much of it and not quite managing. Then the freeze came for real. It was a clear, still evening, which is the worst kind in late autumn. Cloud holds the day's warmth in like a blanket. A clear sky lets it all run straight up into space, and by 2 in the morning the cold pools down in the low ground where Frank's young grafts were. Those 2-year heritage trees he'd spent the last of his strength splicing, the ones that were the whole reason the place was worth keeping instead of clearing. A hard freeze on tender new wood and you don't lose a season. You lose years. You lose the trees themselves. I was checking the thermometer on my own porch when the number dropped past where I liked it. I called the county frost line out of habit, the recorded forecast for the orchard belt, and the voice said it plain. 26 degrees by 4 a.m. in the low blocks, maybe colder in the hollows. I knocked on Nora's door. She came out already half-dressed, the way you learn to sleep when you farm. "We've got a freeze coming into the east block," I said. "Your dad's grafts are sitting right in the cold sink. We've got maybe 3 hours to get heat and water moving, or you lose them." She didn't ask a single useless question. She just said, "What do we do?" We loaded the truck in the dark. Frank had a stack of old orchard heaters in the barn, the squat, oil-burning kind people quit using years ago, and a sprinkler line he'd run down the young rows the spring before he got sick, because Frank thought ahead even when his body was quitting on him. Water gives off heat as it freezes, just enough, if you keep it running, to hold the buds a couple degrees above killing. It's an old trick and a miserable one. You spend the whole night soaked to the elbow in water that's a hair from ice, lighting smudge pots and praying the line doesn't clog. We called Earl. He came in his truck 20 minutes later in his coveralls, and behind him Diego, the young picker, and behind Diego a neighbor of Frank's named Sal, who'd seen my porch light and Earl's truck go by and figured out the rest. Nobody had to be asked twice. That's the part about this work that town people never understand. When the cold comes for a man's trees in the middle of the night, the whole valley shows up in its long johns. For the next 3 hours we worked. We got the sprinkler line charged and running down the young rows so the water came up in a fine spray and froze in a glaze over the buds, and you'd think the ice would kill them, but it's the opposite. The ice coat is what saves them, as long as the water never stops. Nora ran the line. She was everywhere at once, soaked to the shoulders, hair frozen in little points at the ends, calling out when a head clogged and crawling down the row on her knees to clear it with her bare fingers, because gloves were too clumsy for the work. I lit the heaters down the cold edge. Earl and Sal worked the far end. Diego ran fuel. Once, around 3, the main valve stuck and the whole line started losing pressure, and if it dropped out for 10 minutes in that cold, the ice would quit giving heat and start taking it, and we'd lose everything we'd worked all night to save. I was up at the pump trying to free the valve with a wrench, and my hands wouldn't close right from the cold. Nora came running up out of the dark, took one look, and braced her whole weight on the wrench with me, the two of us hauling on it together, and it broke loose, and the line surged back, and the spray came up silver in the heater light all down the row. She sat back in the frozen mud, breathing hard, and looked at the water arcing over her father's trees, and she started to laugh. Not because anything was funny, because we'd held it. By the time the sun came up gray over the ridge, the temperature had bottomed out and started to climb, and the buds were sitting safe under their coats of ice that would melt off harmless by noon. We walked the rows in the first light, all 5 of us, soaked and gray-faced and steaming in the cold air, checking the young trees one by one. They'd made it. Every one. Earl came down the row to where Nora was standing with frost in her hair and her hands raw, and he stopped in front of her and pushed his cap back. "Your daddy'd have stayed up all night for these trees too," he said. "You did right by 'em." She straightened up like those few words weighed more than every speech Dale had ever made. Back at the house, I put dry towels by the bathroom and got coffee going, even though it was nearly time to start the day, not end it. She came into the kitchen wearing one of my old flannel shirts because everything she owned was soaked and ruined, the sleeves hanging down past her hands. "I look ridiculous," she said. "You look like you worked." She sat down at the table. The jar of her father's cider caught the early light on the windowsill behind her, brown and gold. She looked at it a while. "Do you still see me like that first night?" she asked. "Soaked on your porch, with a folder I couldn't even read?" I thought about it. The scared girl with the cold tin box was still in there somewhere, sure. But there was a lot more in there now. The woman who told Dale to get his buyers off her land. The woman who crawled down a frozen row on her knees, clearing sprinkler heads with bare hands to save trees her father grafted. The woman who hauled on that wrench beside me at 3 in the morning and laughed when the water came back. "No," I said. "I don't." Her eyes held mine. The house was quiet around us, just the coffee dripping and the cold ticking off as the sun came up. She stood first. I stood too. Neither of us said anything careful or smart. When she stepped closer, I didn't move away. What happened between us that morning wasn't part of any arrangement. It wasn't a thing we were putting on for Dale or the town or a lawyer reading papers in an office over the bank. It was quiet and honest and ours. And when it was over, the sun was full up over the ridge and the ice was already melting off her father's trees. Later, with her asleep beside me, and her hand resting on my chest like it had always been there, I lay awake, and for the first time since I'd signed that certificate, I was afraid. Not of Dale, not of the deadline. I was afraid of what would happen when the orchard was safe and the reason for all this was gone. Because by then I knew it wasn't the orchard I was trying so hard to keep. The estate meeting was set for Thursday morning, the day before the deadline, in the lawyer's office over the bank. Margaret Shaw had handled Frank's affairs for 30 years, and she'd known him since before Nora was born, which made her a good deal harder for Dale to roll over than he was counting on. Dale arrived like a man who'd practiced his winning face in the mirror. I saw him through the office window before he came up. Pressed slacks, the wool coat again, those clean loafers. He parked the leased SUV next to my mudcake truck and looked at my truck the way he looked at everything that worked for a living. Nora stood beside me on the landing holding a binder twice as thick as the tin box she'd carried to my door a week and a half before. She had the grafting knife in her coat pocket. I'd seen her slip it in that morning. "You ready?" I asked. "No," she said. Then she squared her shoulders. "But I'm walking in anyway." That was plenty. Margaret Shaw's office smelled of old paper and cold coffee. Dale was already seated when we came in, one ankle up on his knee like he owned the chair and the building and every acre under discussion. He glanced at Nora's binder, then at me. "Brought your hired man for muscle?" Nora sat before I could answer. "I brought my husband." "That word's doing a lot of heavy lifting this week," Dale said. Margaret cleared her throat. She was a small, exact woman with reading glasses on a chain and a way of squaring papers that made you sit up straight without knowing why. "We're here," she said, "to confirm compliance with the marriage condition in Frank's estate documents and to address Mr. Vance's stated concerns about operational control of the property. Let's keep it civil." Dale leaned forward. "Good. Then let's address the obvious. This marriage is a stunt." She panicked, grabbed the nearest broke neighbor with a fence line, and now we're all sitting here pretending it's a real thing. He spread his hands. "She's 26. She's got no management experience. She's a nurse, for God's sake. She doesn't understand the debt load, the water rights, the liability, the carrying cost of 30 acres of trees that lose money in 3 years out of 5. Selling to Hartwell is the only responsible thing on the table." Nora's hand tightened on the binder. I wanted to reach over and put mine on top of it. I didn't. Not yet. Margaret looked at Nora. "Would you like to respond?" The room went still. A week earlier she'd have looked at me first. She didn't this time. She opened the binder. "Yes," she said, "I would." She laid it out one page at a time, paid invoices first, fuel and spray, and 2 equipment repairs, the new fence brace, then the supplier agreements, including one she'd renegotiated herself for a better rate than her father had ever gotten, crew schedules with every name and every shift, a repair plan for the cider barn roof with 2 written bids stapled to it, a signed note from Earl and Diego and the rest of the crew saying they accepted her as the person who made the daily calls on the place. Dale laughed under his breath. "You got the pickers to sign a paper. Congratulations." Nora didn't look at him. She turned the page. "I also brought signed statements from Diane at the co-op, from the packing house manager, and from 2 neighboring orchards, all confirming the place is operating and in good standing." She set down one more sheet. "And the frost log from 2 nights ago. We saved 30 rows of my father's heritage graphs off a 25-degree night. Earl can tell you who ran the line." I watched Margaret's eyebrows go up a notch. Nora kept her voice level. "I'm not telling you I know everything. I'm telling you the orchard is running. The bills are getting paid. The roof's getting bid out. The trees are alive. The crew knows whose word counts. And the land is not for sale." Dale's face changed, just a little. The confidence stayed on it, but it pulled tight at the edges. "You rehearsed that nicely." Nora finally turned and looked at him. "Don't interrupt me again." She didn't say it loud. That's what made it land. Dale blinked. I looked down at the table because I nearly smiled, and it wasn't the time. Margaret went through the binder slow, page by page, and with every page Dale got more restless. He checked his watch. He shifted in the chair. Then he quit pretending to be patient. "This is insane," he said. "Frank never meant for her to chain the land up in some fairy tale. He knew she needed a guiding hand. That's the whole reason he wrote the condition in the first place." "No," Nora said. "He wrote it because he knew you'd sell it the day you could." Dale pointed at me. "And what about him? You think Kerrigan's in this out of the goodness of his heart? The man's been one bad season from losing his own place for years. You expect anybody in this room to believe he married you for love?" I felt Nora look at me. So did Margaret. I sat forward. "I don't need her orchard," I said. "I've got 30 acres of my own I can barely keep upright. I didn't marry her for the land." Dale smirked. "That's exactly my point. So why—" "Your point," I said, "is that everything has a price, and a man only ever acts to get paid. That's the only world you can see. I let that sit a second. I married her because Frank was right about one thing. She needed somebody standing next to her while she learned how to plant her feet, with the whole valley waiting to watch her fall over. Nora's eyes went soft, but I kept going, because Dale needed the rest of it. But she's standing now. You've been in that office 20 minutes, calling her a nurse who can't read a checkbook, and she just handed you a frost log and a roof bid and the signatures of every man who works that ground. You can dress it up however you want. Responsible choice, land value, future planning. You don't want the orchard because it's a burden to you. She wants it because it was home before it was ever worth money to anybody. Dale's jaw worked, but the words didn't come right away. Margaret stacked the binder pages, square, and took off her glasses. The marriage license satisfies the stated condition of the estate, she said, and on the basis of these records, Mrs. Kerrigan has demonstrated active operational control of the property. The estate will proceed with Nora retaining full control of the Vance orchard. Mr. Vance, your co-trusteeship does not activate. For a second, nobody moved. Nora closed her eyes. Just once. Then she opened them and nodded, careful, like she was accepting a job and not a prize. Dale stood up so fast the chair scraped the floor. You'll regret this. Both of you. Nora looked up at him. Maybe, but it'll be my regret. He stared at her, waiting for her to shrink the way she would have 2 weeks before. She didn't. He grabbed his coat off the chair and walked out. Through the window, I watched him cross the lot in his clean loafers, stepping around the puddles like the wet ground itself had insulted him. He got in the leased SUV and pulled out without looking back once. Nora didn't chase him. She didn't cry. She sat there with her hands flat on the closed binder, breathing slow. Outside, the air had that scrubbed feel a valley gets the morning after a freeze, cold and clear and open. We walked down the narrow stairs and out into the lot by the trucks. The town went on around us like nothing in the world had happened. A man carried boxes into the hardware store. A woman crossed the street with a sack of groceries. A dog barked somewhere down the block. Nora stood by the passenger door of my truck and looked at the band on her hand. "The orchard's safe," she said. "Looks that way." She nodded, still looking down. "So you don't have to do this anymore." I knew what she meant. I waited. She lifted her eyes to mine. "You helped me more than I had any right to ask for. But the promise got made with a deadline pointed at my head. If you want out, I won't hold you to it. I mean that." For a moment, all I heard was the wet street and the low hum of the bank sign over our heads. 2 weeks ago, I'd have known exactly what to say. I'd have said a deal's a deal, and this one's done. I'd have gone back to my house, my quiet kitchen, my cold suppers, my rows, my notes coming to tie. My whole life shaped exactly the way grief had left it 3 years before. But I thought about the jar of her father's cider on my windowsill, where she'd set it that first night without a word. I thought about her at my table, with the bills flagged in torn paper. I thought about her in my old flannel shirt with frost still in her hair, laughing in the frozen mud because we'd held the line. I thought about her telling Dale, quiet, not to interrupt her again. "I didn't stay because of the paper," I said. Her mouth parted. "And I'm not leaving now that the paper's done its job." She looked at me like she wanted to believe it and was scared to grab at it too fast. So I made it plain, the way I'd made the rule plain that first night. "I thought I was helping you save your home," I said. "Took me till about 3 nights ago to figure out I was finding mine." Her eyes filled, but she was smiling at the same time. Then she reached over and took my hand. We drove back without saying much. We didn't need to. When we came up the lake road to the fence line between my orchard and hers, the morning sun had burned the last of the frost off the trees, and it lay gold over both blocks, mine and Frank's, side by side, worn and crooked and still standing. The young grafts in the east block were green and alive in the light. Nora got out and came up beside me at the fence. Not behind me. Beside me. Her hand stayed in mine. And for the first time in 3 years, when I looked out across that land, I didn't feel alone in it. She still carries the grafting knife. Come spring, she'll learn to use it. I'll show her how Frank held it, thumb along the blade, and she'll cut a scion off one of his old trees and splice it onto new rootstock, and that variety nobody else bothers with will keep going another 40 years, in ground that was never for sale. We're going to replant the creek block, too. Her idea, though I'd been turning it over since the night she stood in my dark yard and called it ground that was waiting on a man to make up his mind. Galus, mostly, because that's what Marie put there, and a few rows of Frank's heritage stock spliced in along the end, so both of them are standing in the same block when the trees come up. Nora says that's the right way to do it. I think she's right. That's the part Dale never understood. Some things you don't take the money for. Some things you stay up all night in the freezing dark to save, and then you spend the rest of your life glad you did.